Part 1. The journey begins. Sarah Martinez stood at the gate of San Diego International Airport, staring at the boarding pass in her trembling hands. The paper was slightly crumpled from her tight grip, and she could see the words First Class Seat 2A, printed clearly in black ink. After 18 hours of traveling from a place she could never speak about, she felt like a ghost walking through the normal world. Her dark brown eyes were heavy with exhaustion. Purple circles shadowed them like bruises, telling the story of sleepless nights in dangerous places. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, still damp from the quick shower she had managed at the base before catching this flight. She wore faded blue jeans with small holes near the knees, old white sneakers that had seen better days, and a gray hoodie that was too big for her small frame. The hoodie was special to her. It belonged to her teammate Jake, who had not made it home from their last mission. She wore it to feel close to him, to carry a piece of his memory with her. The fabric still smelled faintly of the military laundry soap they used overseas. It was her comfort blanket in a world that felt too bright and too loud after months in combat zones. Flight 447 to Atlanta was now boarding first-class passengers. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward the gate agent. The young man in his crisp blue uniform looked at her with surprise when she handed him her boarding pass. He checked it twice, looking from the paper to her face and back again. "First class, ma'am," he said with a puzzled expression. "Right this way." As Sarah walked down the jet bridge, she could feel the stares of other passengers behind her. She heard whispers and saw pointing fingers from the corner of her eye. Her military training had taught her to be aware of everything around her. And right now she felt like prey being watched by hunters. The airplane was a large Boeing 777, gleaming white and blue on the outside. Inside, the first-class cabin was like a different world. The seats were wide and covered in soft leather the color of cream. Each one had its own small television screen and enough legroom for even the tallest person to stretch out completely. The overhead bins were made of polished wood and soft classical music played quietly in the background. Sarah found her seat, 2A, right by the window. She placed her small black backpack in the overhead bin. It was military issue, worn and faded from countless missions. Inside were the only possessions that mattered to her: a few photos, some letters from home, and a medal she had earned but could never talk about. She settled into the leather seat and immediately felt how soft and comfortable it was. Her body, used to sleeping on hard ground and in cramped vehicles, seemed to melt into the cushions. She pulled her hood up over her head and tried to make herself as small as possible. All she wanted was to sleep and forget about everything she had seen and done in the past 3 months. The other first-class passengers began to board, and Sarah could feel their eyes on her immediately. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a pearl necklace that probably cost more than Sarah's yearly salary stopped in the aisle next to her seat. She wore a black business suit that fit her perfectly and carried a designer handbag that sparkled with small diamonds. "Robert," the woman whispered loudly to her husband, "look at this. What is someone like that doing in first class?" Her husband, a man with silver hair and an expensive watch, shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Margaret. Maybe she won some kind of contest or something. These airlines have no standards anymore." They took their seats across the aisle from Sarah, but continued to steal glances at her and whisper to each other. Sarah pretended not to hear them, but every word felt like a small knife cutting into her heart. She closed her eyes and tried to think about better times, about her family back home who had no idea what she really did for work. More passengers filed into the cabin. An elderly man in a three-piece suit that looked like it cost thousands of dollars stopped when he saw Sarah. His face showed clear disgust as he looked at her clothes and shook his head before moving to his seat. A young couple in matching designer outfits pointed at her and giggled quietly, making jokes about how she must have stolen the ticket or snuck onto the wrong plane. Each comment and stare made Sarah feel smaller and more alone. She had faced enemy bullets and bombs without flinching. But this kind of attack was different. This struck at her heart, at her sense of belonging in her own country. She pulled the hood further down over her face and tried to disappear completely. The flight attendant, a woman named Jessica with bright red lipstick and a fake smile, stopped by Sarah's seat. She looked at the young woman with obvious confusion and slight annoyance. "Excuse me, miss," Jessica said in a voice that was trying to be polite but failing. "Can I see your boarding pass one more time?" Sarah handed over the crumpled paper without saying a word. Jessica examined it carefully, checking the seat number against the number above Sarah's head. Her lips pressed together in a thin line as she handed it back. "Thank you," Jessica said coldly, then moved on to greet the other first class passengers with warm smiles and friendly conversation. Sarah watched through the small airplane window as the sun began to set over San Diego. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, beautiful colors that reminded her of peaceful times before her life became about missions and secrets and staying alive. She thought about her little apartment waiting for her in Virginia, about her cat Whiskers who was staying with her neighbor, about the normal life that felt so far away. As more passengers settled in around her, the whispers and stares continued. Sarah's hands began to shake slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion and emotion. She had given everything for her country, had sacrificed pieces of her soul in places most people would never even hear about. And now, sitting in a seat she had every right to occupy, she felt like an unwelcome stranger in the very country she had sworn to protect. The plane was almost full now, and Sarah could feel the tension building around her. She had survived enemy attacks and dangerous missions, but this journey home was becoming its own kind of battle. Part 2. The confrontation. The airplane cabin was filling up with passengers when a loud voice cut through the quiet atmosphere like a sharp knife. Sarah had just begun to relax in her window seat when she heard heavy footsteps stomping down the aisle toward the first-class section. Richard Blackstone was a man who was used to getting his way in every situation. At 55 years old, he stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive black suit perfectly. His gray hair was slicked back with gel and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. A thick gold watch wrapped around his wrist and diamond cufflinks sparkled from his shirt sleeves. Everything about him screamed money and power. He owned 3 successful companies and flew first class at least twice a week for business meetings. Richard expected certain things when he traveled, and one of those things was being surrounded by people who belonged in his world. When he saw Sarah hunched in her seat with her hood pulled up, his face immediately twisted with anger and disgust. "What in the world is this?" he said loudly enough for everyone in first class to hear. "This is absolutely ridiculous." Richard dropped his leather briefcase on his seat with a loud thud and immediately pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The small ding rang out 3 times as he jabbed at it repeatedly with his thick finger. Other passengers turned to look at what was causing the commotion. Jessica hurried over to his seat, her high heels clicking rapidly on the airplane floor. She had been working as a flight attendant for 8 years and could sense trouble the moment she saw Richard's red face and clenched fists. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Jessica asked with a nervous smile. Richard pointed directly at Sarah, who was trying her best to become invisible in her seat. "There has obviously been some kind of terrible mistake here. That young woman clearly does not belong in first class. Just look at her clothes, look at the way she's dressed. This is embarrassing for your airline and uncomfortable for the rest of us paying customers." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame as every person in the first-class cabin turned to stare at her. She kept her eyes focused on her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. Her military training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was a different kind of attack than anything she had faced in combat. Jessica glanced at Sarah and then back at Richard. She knew that Sarah's ticket was legitimate because she had already checked it twice, but she also knew that Richard was a platinum member who spent tens of thousands of dollars with the airline every year. Keeping him happy was important for her job. "Sir, I can assure you that all passengers in first class have valid tickets," Jessica said carefully. "Valid tickets?" Richard laughed loudly. "That ticket could be fake, stolen, or she could have used someone else's name. There is no way someone dressed like that paid for a first-class seat. She probably doesn't even have enough money for a bus ticket, let alone flying up here with decent people." The cruel words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had paid for the ticket with her own money, saved from months of combat pay and hazardous duty allowances. The airline had offered her the upgrade as a small thank you for her military service, though she couldn't tell anyone that detail. Margaret, the woman with the pearl necklace, leaned forward in her seat. "He's absolutely right. This is first class, not some homeless shelter. I paid good money for peace and quiet, not to sit next to someone who looks like she hasn't showered in weeks." Her husband, Robert, nodded in agreement. "The standards have really gone downhill. In my day, you had to dress appropriately to fly first class. Now they let anyone up here. More passengers began to voice their complaints. An older man in an expensive suit said that Sarah was making him uncomfortable. A young woman in designer clothes took out her phone and started recording, saying she was going to post about this on social media to shame the airline. Richard felt empowered by the support and became even louder and more aggressive. I want her moved to economy class immediately, or I'm getting off this plane and demanding a full refund. I'll also be filing complaints with the airline headquarters and posting negative reviews everywhere I can. Sarah finally looked up, and for a moment Richard saw something in her dark eyes that made him pause. There was pain there, but also a strength and dignity that didn't match his assumptions about her. She looked directly at him when she spoke, and her voice was calm and steady despite the attacks coming from all directions. Sir, I have every right to be in this seat. My ticket is real and I paid for it myself. I'm not bothering anyone or causing any trouble. I just want to get home safely. Her words were simple and honest, but Richard was too angry and embarrassed to back down now. He had made his position clear in front of all these people, and admitting he might be wrong was not something his pride could handle. Don't try to turn this around on me, he snapped. I can spot a troublemaker from a mile away. You clearly don't belong here and everyone can see it. Just accept it and move to where you're supposed to be. Jessica felt trapped between her duty to treat all passengers fairly and her need to keep the airline's most valuable customers happy. She looked at Sarah with apologetic eyes but felt pressured by the growing crowd of complaints. Ma'am, perhaps we could find you a nice seat in economy class to avoid any further disruption, Jessica suggested quietly. This is ridiculous, called out a voice from the back of the first class section. A middle-aged man in a casual button-down shirt stood up. You people should be ashamed of yourselves. You're judging someone based on their clothes and treating her like garbage. This is America, not some country club. Mind your own business, Richard shot back. If you want to sit next to people like that, you can move to economy too. The cabin was now divided into two camps. Some passengers supported Richard and wanted Sarah removed, while others felt uncomfortable with the obvious discrimination happening right in front of them. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah sat in the middle of it all, trying to hold on to her dignity while her heart broke into pieces. Flight attendants gathered near the galley, whispering urgently about what to do. The situation was escalating quickly and they needed to resolve it before takeoff. Jessica knew she had to make a decision soon, but every choice seemed wrong. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about her teammates who were still overseas, still fighting for the freedom of the very people who were now trying to throw her off the plane. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Part 3. The Humiliation. The argument in the first-class cabin had been going on for 10 minutes when Jessica finally made her decision. She could not handle the situation alone anymore. Richard Blackstone was getting louder and more demanding. Other passengers were taking videos with their phones, and some people were threatening to get off the plane if something was not done immediately. Jessica walked quickly to the cockpit door and knocked 3 times. The small window slid open and she could see Captain James Rodriguez reviewing his flight charts. He was a man in his early 40s with kind brown eyes and graying hair at his temples. He had been flying commercial airlines for 15 years after serving 8 years as a Navy pilot. Captain Rodriguez, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation in first class that needs your attention, Jessica said through the small opening. The captain looked up from his papers with concern. What kind of situation? There's a passenger complaint about another passenger in first class. It's getting pretty heated and I think we need your authority to resolve it before we can take off. Captain Rodriguez frowned. He had dealt with difficult passengers before, but usually these things could be handled by the flight crew without involving the pilot. If Jessica was asking for his help, the situation must be serious. I'll be right out, he said, setting down his charts. When the cockpit door opened and Captain Rodriguez stepped into the cabin, the arguing voices immediately became quieter. He was wearing his crisp blue pilot uniform with 4 gold stripes on his sleeves, and his presence commanded respect from everyone on the plane. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, he said in a calm but authoritative voice. I understand we have some concerns that need to be addressed before we can begin our flight to Atlanta. Richard immediately stepped forward, seeing this as his chance to get what he wanted. Captain, thank goodness you're here. This situation is completely unacceptable. That young woman over there clearly does not belong in first class, and she's making everyone uncomfortable. The captain looked toward Sarah's seat, where she sat quietly with her head down, trying to make herself invisible. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she looked like she wanted to disappear completely. She's obviously not first-class material, continued Margaret, the woman with the pearls. Just look at her clothes and the way she carries herself. We paid premium prices for a premium experience, and this is not what we expected. Several other passengers nodded in agreement and voiced their complaints. They talked about safety concerns, about standards, about their rights as paying customers. The captain listened to all of their arguments while studying the situation carefully. Sarah finally looked up at Captain Rodriguez, and their eyes met for a brief moment. He saw exhaustion there and sadness, but also a quiet dignity that reminded him of something he could not quite place. There was something familiar about the way she held herself, even in this humiliating situation. Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass, please? The captain asked Sarah directly. With trembling hands, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper. She handed it to Captain Rodriguez, who examined it carefully. The ticket was completely legitimate. Seat 2A, first class, paid in full. This appears to be in order, the captain said, but the complaining passengers were not satisfied. That could be forged, Richard insisted, or she could have bought it with stolen money. Either way, she clearly doesn't belong up here with decent people. The captain felt pressure from multiple directions. He had a cabin full of upset first-class passengers threatening to complain to the airline headquarters. He had social media videos being recorded that could go viral and damage the airline's reputation. He had a schedule to keep and other passengers waiting to take off. Ma'am, he said to Sarah, his voice gentle but firm, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and move to an available seat in economy class. We need to resolve this situation so we can get everyone safely to their destination. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow to her stomach. She had expected this outcome, but hearing it spoken officially by the captain made it feel final and devastating. Around her, she could hear murmurs of satisfaction from the passengers who had complained about her. I understand, Captain, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood up slowly and reached for her small backpack in the overhead bin. As she stretched up to grab it, her hoodie sleeve rolled up slightly on her right arm. For just a moment, Captain Rodriguez caught a glimpse of what looked like a tattoo on her forearm, but it was too quick and partial to see clearly. Sarah pulled her backpack down and slung it over her shoulder. She looked around the first-class cabin one last time, seeing the faces of the people who had judged her so harshly. Some looked satisfied with their victory, while others appeared uncomfortable with what had just happened. Thank you for flying with us, she said politely to Jessica, showing more grace in defeat than her accusers had shown in victory. As Sarah walked down the aisle toward economy class, she passed by Richard Blackstone. He was settling back into his seat with a smug smile on his face, clearly pleased that he had gotten his way. He did not even look at her as she passed. The economy class cabin was completely different from first class. The seats were smaller and closer together, covered in plain blue fabric instead of leather. There was less legroom, smaller windows, and the overall feeling was much more cramped and basic. Sarah found an empty middle seat near the back of the plane, wedged between a large man reading a newspaper and a woman with a crying baby. She squeezed into the narrow space and tried to make herself comfortable, but after experiencing the luxury of first class, economy felt like a punishment. The other economy passengers had watched the whole drama unfold, and now they whispered among themselves about the young woman who had been thrown out of first class. Some felt sorry for her, while others figured she must have deserved it somehow. Sarah put on her seatbelt and stared out the small window at the airport ground crew preparing the plane for takeoff. She thought about all the times she had flown in military transport planes with no seats at all, sitting on the floor or on hard benches for hours at a time. She thought about sleeping in muddy foxholes and eating cold rations while under enemy fire. But somehow, this rejection by her own countrymen hurt worse than any physical hardship she had endured in combat. She had given everything for her country, had put her life on the line repeatedly to protect the freedom and safety of people exactly like those who had just humiliated her. As the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to push away the pain. She told herself that she had survived much worse than this, and that she would survive this too. But deep inside, A part of her heart that had remained strong through everything else finally began to crack. Part 4. The recognition Captain James Rodriguez returned to the cockpit feeling uneasy about what had just happened in the passenger cabin. He tried to focus on his pre-flight checklist, but his mind kept wandering back to the young woman he had just asked to move to economy class. Something about the whole situation did not feel right to him. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 15 years, and before that he had served 8 years as a Navy pilot. During his military service, he had learned to read people quickly and accurately. It was a skill that had kept him alive in dangerous situations, and it had served him well in civilian life too. The way that young woman had carried herself under pressure bothered him. Most people would have gotten angry or argued or caused a scene when faced with such public humiliation, but she had remained calm and dignified, accepting the unfair treatment with a grace that reminded him of his fellow military officers. Then there was that brief glimpse he had caught of something on her forearm when she reached for her bag. It had only been visible for a split second when her sleeve rolled up, but Captain Rodriguez could have sworn he saw the edge of a tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but something that looked military in nature. His co-pilot, First Officer Michael Chen, noticed the captain's distraction as they completed their safety checks. "Everything okay?" Captain Rodriguez, Chen asked. "You seem worried about something." "That situation in first class," the captain replied, shaking his head. "Something doesn't add up about it." "What do you mean?" Chen asked. "The way she handled herself under pressure. The composure she showed. Most civilians would have broken down or fought back, but she just accepted it with military bearing." "Military bearing?" Chen raised an eyebrow. "You think she's military?" "I'm not sure, but there was something about her that reminded me of my Navy days. And I thought I saw part of a tattoo on her arm that looked familiar." Captain Rodriguez could not shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him there was more to this story than what appeared on the surface. "I need to go check on something," he told his co-pilot. "Can you finish the pre-flight checklist?" "Of course, Captain," Chen replied. "Take your time." Captain Rodriguez left the cockpit and walked through the first-class cabin toward economy class. The passengers who had complained about Sarah were now settled comfortably in their seats, looking pleased with themselves for getting their way. Richard Blackstone was sipping champagne and reading a business magazine, clearly satisfied with the outcome. The captain found Sarah in seat 24B, squeezed between 2 other passengers in the cramped middle section of economy class. She was staring out the window with a distant look in her eyes, lost in thoughts that seemed far away from the airplane cabin. "Excuse me, miss," Captain Rodriguez said gently, leaning down so he could speak to her quietly. "Could I have a word with you?" Sarah looked up with surprise. "Is there a problem, Captain?" she asked. "No problem at all. I just wanted to ask you a few questions, if that's okay." Sarah nodded and carefully squeezed out of her seat to follow the captain to a quiet area near the galley where they could talk privately. "I hope you don't mind me asking," the captain began. "But where are you traveling from today, San Diego?" "California," Sarah replied simply. "And before that?" the captain pressed gently. Sarah hesitated for a moment. She had been trained never to reveal operational details, but she could provide basic information. "I was overseas on deployment, sir." The word deployment hit Captain Rodriguez like lightning. Civilians did not use that word. Only military personnel talked about deployments. His suspicions were growing stronger by the second. "What branch of service?" he asked directly. Sarah studied his face carefully. She could see the understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "United States Navy, sir." "How long have you been in? 6 years, Captain." "I'm a petty officer, second class." Captain Rodriguez felt his heart begin to race. A Navy petty officer returning from overseas deployment, exhausted and wearing civilian clothes, flying out of San Diego, which was home to some of the most elite military units in the world. "Ma'am, would you mind if I asked to see your military ID?" he said respectfully. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. From it, she extracted a military identification card and handed it to the captain. His hands trembled slightly as he read the information printed on it. The card identified her as Sarah Martinez, Petty Officer, Second Class, United States Navy. But it was the unit designation that made his blood run cold. She was assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, which was the official name for the most elite fighting force in the American military. My God, he whispered under his breath. "You're a Navy SEAL." Sarah nodded quietly. "Yes, sir, I am." Captain Rodriguez looked at her with new eyes now. This was not just any service member. This was one of America's most elite warriors, someone who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions and the hardest training the military had to offer. Only a tiny percentage of people who tried to become SEALs ever succeeded, and even fewer were women. "Ma'am, may I ask what you were doing overseas?" "I can't give you specific details, Captain, but my team was conducting operations to protect American interests and save lives." "How long were you deployed?" 3 months this time. "We came home 2 days ago." Captain Rodriguez felt sick to his stomach as he realized what had just happened. This woman had been risking her life in combat to protect American freedom and security. She had probably seen things and done things that most people could never imagine. And when she came home, exhausted and traumatized from her service, her own countrymen had treated her like garbage. "Ma'am, when you reached for your bag earlier, I thought I saw something on your arm. Would you mind showing me?" Sarah looked around to make sure no other passengers were watching, then slowly rolled up the sleeve of her hoodie. There, tattooed on her right forearm in black ink, was the Navy SEAL trident. It was the most recognizable symbol of America's elite warriors, featuring an eagle, anchor, trident, and flintlock pistol. Below the trident were 5 small hash marks, each one representing a combat deployment to dangerous parts of the world. This young woman had not just served her country, she had served it in the most dangerous and demanding way possible. Captain Rodriguez stared at the tattoo with a mixture of awe and shame. He was looking at a genuine American hero, someone who had earned the right to be treated with the highest respect and gratitude. Instead, she had been humiliated and cast out like an unwanted person. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I owe you the deepest apology. What happened to you today was completely wrong and unacceptable." Sarah started to speak, but the captain held up his hand. "No, ma'am. Please let me finish. You have served this country with honor and distinction. You have earned the right to sit anywhere you want on this aircraft or anywhere else in America. What those passengers did to you was disgraceful." For the first time since boarding the plane, Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief and gratitude. Finally, someone understood who she was and what she had sacrificed. Part 5. Justice and Honor Captain James Rodriguez walked back toward the cockpit with Sarah's military identification card still in his hand. His mind was racing with anger and determination. He had made a terrible mistake by allowing this decorated Navy SEAL to be humiliated and thrown out of first class. Now it was time to make things right, not just for Sarah, but for every service member who had ever been judged unfairly. "Change of plans," he told his co-pilot Michael Chen as he entered the cockpit. "We're going to make an announcement before takeoff." "An announcement?" Chen looked puzzled. "About what?" "About honoring American heroes and teaching some people a lesson they'll never forget." Captain Rodriguez picked up the intercom microphone and switched it to the cabin-wide setting so that every passenger on the entire airplane would hear his words clearly. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone who would not be questioned. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we begin our flight to Atlanta this evening, I have something very important to share with all of you." The entire cabin fell silent. Passengers stopped their conversations, put away their phones, and turned their attention to the speakers above their heads. In first class, Richard Blackstone looked annoyed at the delay, while in economy class, Sarah wondered what was happening. "About 20 minutes ago, a situation occurred in our first-class cabin that I need to address. A young woman was asked to move from first class to economy class based on complaints from other passengers about her appearance and their assumption that she did not belong in first class." Murmurs began to ripple through the cabin as passengers realized the captain was talking about the incident they had all witnessed or heard about. "I want you all to know that I have just had the honor of speaking with this young woman personally. Her name is Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez, and she is a United States Navy SEAL." Gasps of shock echoed throughout the airplane. In first class, Richard Blackstone's face went completely white. Margaret dropped her champagne glass and the liquid spilled across her expensive dress. Other passengers who had supported the complaint looked at each other with growing horror as they realized what they had done. Petty Officer Martinez has just returned from a 3-month combat deployment. overseas, where she and her team conducted dangerous operations to protect American lives and interests. This is her 5th combat deployment to hostile territories. She has risked her life repeatedly in service to our country and to protect the freedoms that we all enjoy. Captain Rodriguez paused to let his words sink in before continuing. The Navy SEAL trident that she wears on her arm is one of the most difficult military achievements to earn. Less than 1% of people who attempt SEAL training ever succeed. Those who do become part of America's most elite fighting force, and they volunteer to go into the most dangerous situations so that the rest of us can sleep safely at night. Sarah sat in her economy seat with tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of sadness anymore. For the first time in months, someone was publicly recognizing her sacrifice and service. She had spent so long operating in the shadows, unable to tell anyone what she did or where she went, that hearing her service acknowledged felt like a miracle. While Petty Officer Martinez was facing enemy fire and protecting our national security, some passengers on this aircraft chose to judge her based on her clothes and appearance. They assumed she was not good enough to sit in first class. They were wrong, and I am ashamed that this happened on my aircraft. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Passengers who had never given much thought to military service began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Petty Officer Martinez, the captain continued, I am personally inviting you to move to seat 1A in first class, and your entire flight today will be complimentary as a small token of our gratitude for your service. Flight attendants, please ensure that she receives our very best treatment. The announcement was not over yet. To the passengers who complained about her presence in first class, I want you to understand something very important. This young woman has earned the right to sit anywhere she chooses in America. She is paid for that right not with money, but with her service, her sacrifice, and her willingness to put her life on the line for strangers. Richard Blackstone was now sweating profusely. His expensive suit felt tight around his throat, and his hands were shaking. The other passengers in first class were staring at him with disgust and anger. As Americans, we owe our military service members our highest respect and deepest gratitude. Judging them based on their appearance or treating them as second-class citizens is not just wrong. It is a betrayal of the values they fight to protect. Jessica, the flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the situation, immediately walked back to economy class to find Sarah. Her eyes were filled with tears as she approached. Ma'am, I am so deeply sorry for what happened, Jessica said. Please let me escort you back to first class where you belong. As Sarah stood up and began walking toward the front of the plane, something amazing happened. Passengers throughout the economy cabin began to applaud. The sound started softly but grew louder and louder until the entire back section of the airplane was filled with clapping and cheers. When Sarah reached the first-class cabin, the scene was very different from before. Richard Blackstone stood up immediately and stepped directly into her path. His face was red with embarrassment and shame. Ma'am, he said, his voice shaking, I owe you the deepest and most sincere apology of my life. What I said and did was completely inexcusable. Thank you for your service, and please forgive my ignorance and prejudice. Margaret, the woman with the pearls, was crying as she approached Sarah. I am so ashamed of myself, she said. You were protecting our freedom while I was judging you for your clothes. Please forgive me. One by one, every passenger who had complained about Sarah came forward to apologize. Some were crying, others could barely speak, but all of them understood that they had witnessed something that would change them forever. Sarah accepted their apologies with the same grace and dignity she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. She took her seat in 1A, the best seat on the airplane, and looked out the window as the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway. As they lifted off into the evening sky, Sarah thought about her teammates who were still overseas, still fighting for the freedom of people who might never know their names or understand their sacrifice. She thought about Jake, whose hoodie she still wore, and how proud he would be to see her finally getting the recognition she deserved. The flight to Atlanta was smooth and peaceful. Sarah received the best meal, the most attentive service, and the respect of every person on that airplane. When they landed, passengers lined up to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Word of the incident spread quickly through social media and news outlets. The story became a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unappreciated. It sparked important conversations about how we treat our military service members and the danger of judging people based on appearances. For Sarah Martinez, the flight home became something she had never expected. It became a moment when her country finally said thank you. Part 6, The Lasting Impact. When Flight 447 touched down at Atlanta International Airport at 10:30 that evening, Sarah Martinez had no idea that her story was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. Several passengers had posted about the incident on social media during the flight, and the story of the Navy SEAL who was mistreated and then honored was being shared thousands of times every minute. As the plane pulled up to the gate, Captain James Rodriguez made one final announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived safely in Atlanta. I want to remind everyone that what happened on this flight today should serve as a lesson to all of us about the importance of treating every person with respect and dignity. Thank you for flying with us, and please join me in giving one more round of applause for Petty Officer Martinez." The entire airplane erupted in applause once again. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and gratitude from complete strangers. She had spent so many years serving in silence, unable to talk about her missions or receive public recognition for her sacrifices. This moment felt like a dream she had never dared to hope for. As passengers began to leave the plane, many stopped to shake Sarah's hand and thank her personally for her service. An elderly veteran with a World War II cap on his head waited in line for 10 minutes just to salute her properly. A young mother with 2 small children explained to them that Sarah was a real-life hero who kept them safe while they slept. Richard Blackstone was one of the last people to leave the aircraft. He approached Sarah with his head hanging low, carrying a business card in his trembling hand. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know I already apologized, but I wanted you to know that what happened today has changed me completely. I run several companies, and I want to offer you a job whenever you're ready to leave the military. Full salary, full benefits, and the respect you deserve from day one." Sarah looked at the business card and then back at Richard's face. She could see genuine remorse and a desire to make things right. "Thank you, Mr. Blackstone," she said. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready to leave the Navy yet. My teammates are still overseas and they need me." "I understand completely," Richard replied. "The offer will always be open, and I promise you that I will never judge another person based on their appearance again. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget." When Sarah finally left the airplane, she was surprised to find a small crowd waiting at the gate. Airport employees, other travelers, and even some local news reporters had gathered to welcome her. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Welcome home, hero," and people were holding signs thanking her for her service. Airport security cleared a path for Sarah to walk through the crowd safely, but she stopped to shake hands and take pictures with anyone who wanted to meet her. A group of young girls asked for her autograph, telling her they wanted to be just like her when they grew up. "You can be anything you want to be," Sarah told them. "Work hard, never give up, and always treat others the way you want to be treated." The story continued to spread throughout the night and into the next day. News stations across the country picked up the story, and it became the most talked about topic on social media. People shared it with messages about respecting military service members, not judging others by their appearance, and standing up for what is right. Captain James Rodriguez also became part of the story. Interview requests poured in from news programs wanting to talk to the pilot who had stood up for Sarah and delivered such a powerful message about military service. He used every opportunity to talk about the importance of supporting veterans and treating all people with dignity. "This young woman put her life on the line for our country," he told one news reporter. "The least we can do is treat her with the respect and gratitude she has earned. What happened on my aircraft should never happen to any service member anywhere." 3 days after the flight, Sarah returned to her small apartment in Virginia Beach. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had been taking care of her cat Whiskers, was waiting with a stack of letters and packages from people all across the country who had heard her story. "You're famous," Mrs. Chen said with a big smile. "People have been sending you letters and gifts all week. They want to thank you for your service." Sarah sat on her couch with Whiskers purring in her lap and opened letter after letter from children, parents, veterans, and ordinary Americans who had been inspired by her story. Many shared their own experiences with judgment and discrimination, while others simply wanted to say thank you for protecting their freedom. One letter that particularly touched Sarah came from a young girl named Emma in Ohio. "Dear Miss Sarah," it read, "I heard about what happened to you on the airplane. I'm sorry those people were mean to you. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you and protect people too. Thank you for keeping me and my family safe." The airline company also reached out to Sarah with a formal apology and an offer of free flights for life. They implemented new training programs for their employees about treating military service members with proper respect and recognizing the signs of discrimination among passengers. Richard Blackstone kept his word about being changed by the experience. He started a foundation that provided scholarships for children of military families and began volunteering at veterans organizations. He often spoke publicly about his experience on Flight 447 and how meeting Sarah had opened his eyes to his own prejudices. "I thought I was a good person," he would tell audiences, "but I learned that being a good person means more than just following the law or being polite. It means treating every human being with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or what we assume about them." Jessica, the flight attendant who had been caught in the middle of the situation, also used the experience to become an advocate for better treatment of military passengers. She worked with the airline to create special recognition programs for service members and helped train other flight crews about the importance of standing up against discrimination. Margaret, the woman with the pearls who had made cruel comments about Sarah, sent a heartfelt apology letter along with a donation to a veterans charity. "I am ashamed of my behavior," she wrote, "but grateful for the lesson you taught me. I promise to do better and to teach my children and grandchildren to honor those who serve our country." 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah received a phone call that surprised her more than anything else. It was from a young woman named Jennifer who had been sitting in economy class during the flight. "I wanted to call and thank you," Jennifer said, "not just for your military service, but for how you handled that situation with such grace and dignity. I'm a teacher, and I've been sharing your story with my students. You've inspired so many people to be better than they were before." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that something good had come from one of the most painful experiences of her life. Her story was helping people understand the importance of treating others with respect and recognizing the sacrifice made by military service members and their families. She looked at the photos on her wall, showing her with her SEAL teammates, including the picture of Jake, whose hoodie had comforted her during that difficult flight. She knew he would be proud of how she had handled everything, and how her quiet dignity had ended up teaching important lessons to thousands of people. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt proud not just of her military service, but of how she had represented all service members during a moment of crisis. Her story had reminded America that heroes walk among us every day, and that we should never judge people based on their appearance or our assumptions about who they are.